Okay, sorry about that, folks. Seems like we had a little disturbance in the stream here. Let's talk about housing prices, candidates. They've increased astronomically in the last few years in Arizona, which was once more or less affordable. Do you have a plan to deal with housing affordability as a lawmaker, and what can the legislature do to kind of rein in these prices? And I forgot where we were last, so let's start with our Senate candidate. Eva, can you take us out?
Sure. Yeah, obviously we are really approaching or in the midst of a crisis with housing. We were the third highest in population and job growth in recent years, but are third from the bottom in having an adequate housing supply to meet that demand. And we have to address both renters and homeowners in that situation. Both are affected very dramatically. We should be thinking about protections for renters. Arizona has very few protections for renters. I think that we could consider resources for legal representation for those who are facing eviction, because often those issues can be resolved and eviction can be avoided. And I think it's important that we are giving tenants appropriate time to respond to eviction notices and having certain limitations on rent fees and that sort of thing. I think we could also be considering anti-price gouging legislation. Limits on rent increases to a certain percentage plus inflation. That gives landlords room to determine the rent prices, but it protects the public from predatory price gouging. So I think those are a few things we can consider for our renters. I think for as far as increasing low-cost housing, I think that we can use zoning laws to allow municipalities to have more control to be able to establish more low-cost units, to help developers to allocate a certain percentage of their buildings to affordable housing. We did have HB 2674. It was aimed at simplifying the zoning for builders, but ultimately that bill was converted to a committee to study the housing issue. I think that the results of that committee will also influence how we make decisions moving forward. So I think it's important to pay attention to what we learn from that. I think we can also have legislation to give Arizonans priority over out-of-state investors, so that if out-of-state investors are bidding on parcels or properties or even individual homes, priority will be given to Arizona organizations or Arizona residents to match that offer, so that we can have more say and more control over our own state, our own home. And continued investment in the Housing Trust Fund, of course, and then, of course, I can defer to my running mates.
I don't think you left them anything left to talk about. But let's try. Seth, what component of that plan sounds good? What would you add to that? What would you subtract from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, as part of running for office, you know, I talk to members of my community every day. I talk to voters every day. You know, we all three knock on doors every day to understand the concerns of our community. And I can tell you affordable housing is a top concern. You know, people are really struggling out there. You know, rent has gone up by 30% in the last year. Home prices have gotten so high, along with interest rates, that buying is not an option. So you're really stuck in a terrible place where we can't afford renting or buying. Funding the Housing Trust Fund is the most straightforward solution to this. In the last bipartisan budget, we actually got some money towards it for the first time in a decade. It's been cut to near zero since, I believe, the 2009 recession. But let's start there. Let's start putting some money back where it was supposed to be.
Okay, Lorena?
I'm sure I can obviously echo so many things that my running mate said, but I think, you know, affordable housing is a very critical issue, especially in our district. I mean, we are seeing, I can see it. I'm seeing my communities being displaced, you know, right in front of my eyes. And we talk to voters who say their rents have increased by upwards of 40, and I've even heard 50%. And then I asked, did your salary increase by that much? And it's definitely, the answer is no. So how can we expect, you know, our residents to live in a place they've called home for generations if we don't do something about it? I think we could, as I've mentioned, be giving some local control back to our cities and municipalities to work with developers to demand that more affordable housing be included in these developments. Because when we think about affordable housing, I want to destigmatize this phrase as well, because that's me. I'm a first-time home buyer. I was excited to really, buy a house, and now I'm being disenfranchised because there's no way I can afford a 1,200 square foot, $500,000 house in the neighborhood my family has lived in for 100 years. I'm also an educator that works multiple jobs, and I still can't even afford that. So I really want to, talk about this conversation at the legislature to understand what housing is looking like for our communities, in hopes that people who call this place home can continue to call this place home for years to come.
And you mentioned local control and local regulations, which is a good segue into the next question, which is probably the most frequent question we get from voters. What are you going to do about Airbnbs, or some variation on that? As a little bit of context here for voters who haven't been following this, when Airbnbs became a thing, the legislature banned local municipalities, cities from enacting regulations on Airbnbs, short-term rentals. They have since backed off that slightly. But I wonder what y'all think about the Airbnb issue.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Again, I think it goes back to that local control. Yeah, when in 2016 that legislation went through, it put that policy in place to restrict cities and towns from regulating short-term rentals. And so I think cities should be able to set their own regulations regarding that. I've even heard of anything about sound regulations too. Even some of these, properties just aren't being monitored in any way, shape, or form. Also having some of these housing units turn into multi-family housing units, where I've heard of, also people converting their houses into almost like apartment style buildings, where they just build more, rooms within this house, and you could fit, 12 people in there. Can think of the probably parking nightmares and different complications that come along with it. So I truly believe that giving back this control to local government will really help curb this.
Let me follow up on that though. Do you think local government, the cities, should be able to ban Airbnbs entirely?
I think there probably should be a standard set in place for, so many infractions. So yeah, if there's so many infractions or, disturbances or, things that have happened with a certain Airbnb, they should have, the wherewithal to be able to enforce regulations that they see fit.
Okay. Seth, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the idea of someone living in a home for say 30 years in a community, knowing their neighbors, having their kids grow up there, and then now all of a sudden they find themselves next to a party house that every other night has a different group of people who are, loud and, making the neighborhood unsafe is really sad. I mean, if you're one of those people, this is really a terrible issue for you. I think it was Representative Kavanaugh that put forward that initial piece of legislation, and I think he'd readily admit it was extremely the wrong direction to go. Yeah, absolutely. We need to. The closer we can get to the ground, the closer we can get to the locality. Communities should be deciding this for themselves.
Okay. And Eva, did we hit you yet?
No, not yet, but I think that, similar stuff, I think that also sort of lends to that same issue that I talked about before, giving Arizonans priority over out-of-state investors, but definitely legislation to allow local regulatory control. It was the short-term vacation rental, the Airbnb, lobby that convinced them to enact that legislation in 2016 with Governor Ducey's support at the time, and they have backed off of it. They have seen that it has had a negative effect. And I think that local control really comes down to the communities and municipalities understanding their community better than anybody else. And so that's where I think the decision should be made.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about healthcare issues. Why don't we start with the pandemic? How do you believe, and give Arizona a grade, A, B, C, D, F, on its management of the pandemic, and give us a highlight and a low light, if you would, please. Eva, you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's many considerations with regard to the outcomes during the pandemic, because it's not only health outcomes, but we have to look at economic outcomes and social outcomes and educational outcomes. There's no question that Arizona had challenges. Our economy was one of the hardest hit in the nation, and we've had compromises in education as well. But at the same time, we have seen well over 2 million cases of COVID, and over 31,000 people have died. We've had multiple peaks and valleys during this time. There isn't a perfect solution, but I would be dedicated to listening to the people who are most severely impacted. Our healthcare community was just hit so hard as a nurse and as someone who really got to see a lot of that on the front lines. Our healthcare community was hit very hard. As far as giving it a grade, I don't know, that might be a little bit arbitrary. I mean, we had strengths and weaknesses, but I think that, moving forward, I would be dedicated again to listening to people who were impacted, to the experts and the public health officials, and to try to come up with some comprehensive and collaborative solutions moving forward. Hopefully, of course, we're not going to have that same experience that we have been having in the last few years moving forward. We know that we are trending in the right direction, but there's still more work to do.
Okay. Dropping the arbitrary grading system, give us a highlight and a low light, Seth.
I mean, yeah, so I can still remember the first day of the lockdown. I'm a business owner. We have a furniture store, we have a furniture factory, and I remember eagerly awaiting the list of essential businesses that were going to come out from the governor's website. I don't think I slept much that night, and I woke up and I kept refreshing the page until it came up. And thank God we were on that list. If you supplied office furniture, home office furniture, you were exempt because we were going to be helpful in having people work from home. I sympathize completely with any business that had to shut down during this period. If my business had to shut down, we'd be out of business. As far as how we handled the pandemic, the low light would probably be low point would probably be when we were #1 in the world. Is by I think it was either infectiousness or someone correct me on that, but we were the worst place in the world for a bit there. But when it comes to the next pandemic, really, it's kind of sad that this was politically divisive. I think this could have been a moment for our country to come together. It was a disaster, a natural disaster, and we could have faced it as a country. And if it ever happens again, I really hope that we can listen to experts, we can listen to the science, and we can follow the data.
Okay, Lorena, thoughts?
Yeah. Flashbacking to the beginning of the pandemic, and I was a frontline worker working at a grocery store at the time, and thankfully I worked at a store that really valued trying as best as we could, since we were required to go to work to protect their employees. And I know that wasn't the case for so many other people who also had to return to work. So I know there was a huge economic stress that we're still recovering from in the state. The lack of education funding, I think, was really highlighted, and how unprepared we were for something like this. So those are maybe some of the lowlights, but highlights, I guess, including a low light as well, was I got to work with some of our community members and actually a local restaurant here in Mesa to provide COVID relief to our Indigenous communities up north. So we collected PPE, food, toiletries for domestic violence shelters and other Indigenous communities. And we did that because that's what our communities are taught to do, and we stepped up because at the time our Indigenous communities had the highest rates of COVID in the world, and doctors without borders were coming here to Arizona. So it speaks to the integrity of our community. So I'd say that was the highlight, while also addressing that I don't think our state did enough to address the needs of the public.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about abortion. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned the Roe versus Wade precedent on abortion access. And I think the question for Democrats is, what legal restrictions to abortion, if any, do you believe could be justified? And sorry, Lorena, why don't you go again?
Sure. First and foremost, I am not a medical professional, like many of the legislators in our state. And thankfully, I get to defer with Eva, who actually is a women's reproductive health medical professional. But this is a federal protection that had been in place longer than I've been alive, and it's no longer there. And I believe that these decisions should be solely made by an individual and their healthcare provider. I mean, abortion care is critical, life-saving healthcare, and I would do everything in my power to help codify abortion access in the state of Arizona, to ensure that individuals and family have the right to make their own decisions. And I'm committed to preserving that access and also their privacy.
Okay, Seth?
Yeah, I mean, a constitutional right that we've had our entire lives was taken away. And states get to decide the legality of it. Every state surrounding us, it's legal and safe. Here in Arizona, we're dealing with a 1901 ban. You know, this is the fact that we might be arresting doctors and patients, you know, is really terrifying. It's very draconian, and allowing patients to have control over their own bodies, having the government not interfere in a private personal decision between a doctor and a patient. We need to go back to where we were 6 months ago.
Okay. And Eva?
So I work in reproductive healthcare. I work at a women's clinic in Mesa. It's obviously an issue that I'm really passionate about, but it's also an issue that that I'm very close to, because I see these patients. I understand the seriousness of the outcomes that can happen with these type of bans that are being promoted. I also had an abortion earlier this year for a pregnancy that I wanted very badly. That was not viable. But the Republican-led legislature is promoting and passing legislation that endangers patients, and that's not in line with what Arizonans want. And some of the Republican candidates have softened their public positions on abortion policy in response to how unpopular those positions are, but they limit those adjustments to rape, incest, or the life of the mother. And that doesn't take into account some of the most dominant considerations, including the viability of the pregnancy, a situation like I was in, the age of a pregnant patient, wouldn't matter if a patient was 10 or 11 years old, any disabilities or medical conditions that the patient might have, if the patient has cancer and the pregnancy is extremely complicated because of that. And there's no way to appropriately account for all of these considerations in legislation that's sponsored and written by Arizona lawmakers. It's not their place. They're not qualified to do it. I support pregnant individuals and the medical community in their right to provide compassionate and comprehensive health care to those in need without the undue burden of government interference.
Thank you. All right, let's talk a little bit about water. I've got a lot of water questions here, but I guess a good place to start would be, do you think that we should emphasize conservation of water or supplementing of our water supply? And obviously, you know, two sides of a coin, but give us a little bit about your perspective of how we can solve this ongoing drought situation. And Eva, let's just go in reverse order there.
Sure. What an important issue to the people of Arizona. I mean, we have been knocking doors, thousands of doors, talking to people, and this issue comes up so much more than I expected when I initially started to run for office. The people of Arizona are really concerned, and they should be. There's a lot of things that we can do. We should be strengthening the Groundwater Management Act to protect our existing resources. We've been allocated $1 billion over the next 3 years in the budget to address water needs. So I think that that's a step in the right direction. We should be partnering with farmers for sure to convert flood irrigation to drip irrigation. So that's another conservation effort that we can consider. I think that would make a considerable impact. We can provide incentives and work with farmers. Rainwater harvesting is something that we can consider, incentives for cities to encourage conservation. I also absolutely think that the conversation about desalination, I think that's the future. I think that that's an important part of the discussion and that we should be discussing that. But that is 15 years down the line at least before we can have an infrastructure like that in place. And it's going to cost water users 10 times of what we currently pay. So, I mean, that's something that is not a short-term solution. And so we have to be considering both. And it's important to me to be working again with the experts and with the tribes and with our neighboring states who share the same problems to come up with whatever solutions that we can. We can also be partnering with Mexico or California to participate in their desalination efforts and see how we might be able to benefit from that. So I think it's important that we're looking at both, that we're looking to the future. I don't want to ignore that, and that we're also looking for short-term solutions to help get us there.
Okay, Lorena?
There it is. Yeah, so Arizona has been on a looming crisis with our water, and so long that the Republican majority didn't have a hand in protecting it until recently. I know we had this, as I mentioned, the $1 billion invested over 3 years, but still 70% of our water in our state is not regulated. So we really need to monitor, where it's going and what we need to cut back on. So water management is key, but also when we think of climate, we also need to think of lowering the temperature because millions of gallons of water is evaporated, every single day, every week here. And so we need to look for creative solutions, planting more shade in, historically redlined districts. I'm proud that we're all endorsed by the Arizona Tech Council, who I know this is a big initiative for them to ensure that we can continue to live here in this state. We should be the leaders in clean energy, and we can also look at ways to diversify our economy through community colleges and retraining and reemploying our workforce. Because we've already been diverting from coal for quite some time. So I think we really need to look at these new clean energy initiatives as well to keep us sustainable.
Okay, Seth?
Yeah, well, excuse me. One thing we're really lacking on this issue is leadership. In the past, we've been able to come up with solutions for the future in a bipartisan manner, and I think we are really lacking that with our current political leaders. But yeah, I mean, it's going to take both, I guess. Yes, we can look to new technology, but we're also going to have to come up with a new agreement with our surrounding states. We're also going to need to look at usage. We need a sustainable usage plan. The vast majority of water goes to agriculture, and I'm all for agriculture in our state. I wouldn't want to hurt that industry at all. But when you have an example of a company from a foreign country coming in, using our resources and directly exporting that crop directly back to that country without paying taxes on the water, that's just low-hanging fruit that we shouldn't be allowed happening. Lorena alluded to, sort of other changes with our climate, and I would say, this is an opportunity for Arizona as we see our climate change. We're very blessed here in our state with amazing weather. We have more days of sunlight than nearly any other place in the world. We should be the solar capital of the world. Right now, we buy our solar panels from Germany and from China. We should be manufacturing those solar panels right here. We should be doing the research and development right here. This could be an economic boon for our state if only we had the foresight to see it.
Let me follow up. Would you support residential restrictions? We've seen other cities around the Southwest putting in restrictions on how much water people can use, decorative lawns, just grass in your front yard. Are we at that point yet that we should start looking at restricting the amount of water that a residential house can use?
Yeah, so here in Mesa, we're in stage 1 of the water emergency plan, and I believe Lorena can correct me on this, but I believe that restricts how much the government in its buildings can use, and if it keeps going this way, that's part of the drought contingency plan. I really don't want to get to that point. I really think if we had people in the legislature and a governor that were really interested in solving this problem. $1 billion is great, but it's a great start. We need to be really looking at this problem as the emergency that it's becoming.
Sorry, let's continue on. Lorena?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with Seth. He was correct that, yeah, City Mesa is currently, cutting back on their water usage. But I think it's a very real reality we could be coming to if we don't figure out how to, really manage our water supply. Would I like it to come to that? Absolutely not. But I'm looking forward to getting to the legislature to really see where we are at in the situation and figure out the best way forward.
Okay. Eva, can we keep having yards?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more interested in incentives than restrictions, especially at this point in time. And again, incentives for rain harvesting or for cities and different usage there. As far as creating legislation to encourage restrictions or mandates and things like that, certainly it's got to be a part of the conversation because a lot of people are interested in that and talking about that. But that's not something that I'm interested in writing or sponsoring legislation for right now.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about elections, but first we have a question that came in from the audience that I really like. Why do you feel better prepared for this job than your opponents? And Eva, why don't we start with you again?
Yeah, so I know I'm better prepared for this job than my opponent, and primarily because of my commitment to representation. My opponent was very adamant that his primary opponent, Tyler Pace, was not far right enough. He was a very reliable conservative in the legislature, but he was criticized persistently by my opponent for not being far enough to the right, for not being a real Republican. And I think that what really qualifies me in this race is that I'm committed to listening to the people of my district and representing them. I understand that that the legislature is not my own personal ballot where I'm going to cast only votes that are of my personal interest, that it's my responsibility to listen to people in my district, which is made up of primarily independents and then split right down the middle between Democrats and Republicans, and to try to come up with collaborative, common sense, comprehensive solutions that everybody can live with. And I know that I am more committed to the people of my district and to coming up with collaborative solutions than my opponent is. And I think that that's the answer to that question.
Okay, Lorena?
Sure. I absolutely know that myself and my running mates are the best candidates for this district because we look like our district. We look like the community we're intending to serve, and we're running to serve everybody. We are not an extremist slate that's not willing to listen to other perspectives and ideas. We're advocating for everyone and not just a faction of people that think like ourselves. I'll speak to one of the candidates I'm running against, and Seth can speak to the other. Kathy Pierce is a sister of Russell Pierce, who's the only recalled legislator in the state of Arizona, as he was the author of very discriminatory legislation, including SB 1070. I will tell you, as a district whose 38% population happens to be Latino, I think that's a very huge cause for concern, considering he's backing and supporting that campaign. And the residents of this area have already, attested that they are not going to stand for this type of rhetoric, discrimination or hate. And so I believe I'm the best person, qualified for one of these House seats because I am staunchly involved in my community. I look forward to really being that connection between others, and not just with our local government officials that we work with, but also community organizations to ensure that the policies that we're going to be creating at the state level have our community in mind, because we bring those policies to them before bringing them back to the legislature.
All right, Seth?
Yeah, so I come from a background of a business owner. I have experience managing a budget. I have experience in making a payroll, and these are real skills that you develop over time that will come quite useful in the legislature. I would say, we are out there every day speaking to members of our community, and that's Democrats, Republicans, Independents. We talk to everyone. We talk to everyone. When it really, if you look at what our opponents are saying, if you look at who our opponents are talking to, they are talking to not only just their party, but an extreme minority within their party, a small extreme base of their party. And that's who they mean to represent. We want to represent everyone in this district, not just our party, everyone. The fact that they didn't show up for this event is even a very clear reason why they're unfit for this job. Another reason why the other one is unfit, Lorena mentioned Kathy Pierce. Marian Mendoza is banned from Twitter for posting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. anti-Semitism, this should be completely disqualifying for anyone running for office. The fact that she's even close to possibly holding a public office is just embarrassing. You know, the idea that someone who openly espouses this view is short a time ago as 2 weeks ago, she still said sympathetic things about this. The idea that this person has a roughly 50% chance of coming to power, you know, we're really in trouble if we're electing extremists like our opponents.
All right, let's talk a little bit about elections, specifically the election we're all still talking about, 2020. You're all Democrats. I assume you think Joe Biden won the 2020 election in Arizona and the US fair and square. I guess the question should be, a huge part of the population, including many of your constituents, should you be elected, do not believe that. How can you turn that around? What can you as a lawmaker do to restore faith in our democracy? And Seth, want to take this one first?
Yeah. So we all agree we need safe and secure elections. And I just want to add also that, you know, we've seen hundreds of voter suppression bills last session. We've seen lots of voter suppression laws over the last several years. We should be not making it harder for people to vote. We should be making it easier for people to vote. We should be extending access to the ballot box to as many people as possible. The more people that vote, the more representative our democracy is. The more representative our democracy is, the stronger our democracy is. As far as restoring faith, you know, with the people who have lost it, begins with conversations. The conversations we're having at the doors every day. I talk to Republicans every day. And, you know, that's where it starts. And I would also have to say that, you know, we need to look at reforms. You know, I feel like everyone's complaining about, you know, these siloed worlds that, you know, people are living in these days with their own facts. But no one's really doing anything about it. And we really need to be looking at reforms to try to, you know, looking at legislation in a bipartisan manner, to bring ourselves together on common sense solutions, and not focused on conspiracy theories that, you know, a minority of the population believe in.
All right, Lorena.
Yeah, I think, you know, I can sympathize with the idea that some people are losing faith in our democracy. And I think it's up to us, especially as legislators, to build upon those relationships and be active in our community and be visible and show that we are willing to have those very difficult conversations to help restore that democracy. But I do believe that it is on the line this election, especially when, you know, last session, approximately 10% of the voter suppression bills were in the nation were submitted from Arizona. And we need to be worried about what it looks like if we take early voting away. I was talking to a community member at the door, and she happened to live permanently with the patient she was taking care of. So she asked me point blankly, you know, I heard that, you know, the legislature is considering, the Republican majority of it was considering taking away early voting by mail. And she said that simply, you know, wouldn't be feasible or possible. It can't happen because there's no way that my patient who has ALS, that I could have them standing in line waiting to vote when this is, you know, an accessible way to do so. Thinking about that too, this is also very necessary for our rural communities. We think about the access that they have to the ballot box. So I agree with Seth, we need to be, you know, expanding access to voting, not limiting it, but also helping restore that democracy by being visible legislators that will listen to our community.
Okay, Eva?
Yeah, similar sentiments, of course. The Republicans, to Lorena's point about voter suppression legislation, the Republicans did introduce at least 3 bills that would have allowed the legislature to overturn election results. So I think when we're having this conversation about what we can do, it's also really important to talk about what we absolutely must not do. Lawmakers do not decide elections. Voters decide elections. We should have transparency and accountability in our elections. I believe in that. We have to maintain trust in the process. And that's an ongoing effort that I support. And I agree with my running mates that one of the most important things that we can do is to be present in our community so that people are being heard, to be responsive to their concerns and requests, and to not shrink and shy away from them. But, you know, about 80% of Arizona voters vote by mail. We've been using that system for 30 years, and that process has to be protected. It allows older adults and those with various mobility restrictions to vote. It also allows those who have difficulty voting because of transportation issues or work schedules to be able to vote. We should be bringing as many voices as possible into the civic process, and voters want that option, and I'm on their side.
Okay. So we've also got an election coming up, and candidates are not the only thing on the ballot. We've also got 10 statewide ballot questions that voters will have to wrestle with. I want to ask, which of these do you think is the most important initiative for referenda? And that can be either important as in we need voters to kill this, or we need voters to pass this. Eva, you want to start us off?
Yes, so I'm the healthcare person, so I'm very much in support of Prop 209, which is the ballot initiative to address predatory medical debt collection. We have a huge affordability problem for healthcare. It affects my district, it affects all Arizonans, it affects this country. But these predatory practices for debt collection don't make it any easier on families to be able to provide for their families, for their continued medical needs, or to be able to pay those bills. So that's legislation that I think is really important. I hope that we have the support for it. I hope that it passes. Prop 209 is a measure that I support.
Okay. Seth, you want to go next?
Yes, and let me just say Prop 209, or limiting medical debt and predatory medical debt, it's a fantastic cause. I will be voting yes on that proposition, but I got to go with the dark money one. Our nation, our state is in desperate need of campaign finance reform. Dark money in our politics, the idea that people can be donating unlimited sums to organizations that then can essentially buy elections without disclosing who those donors are. This is the most insidious form of why we need campaign finance reform. This is absurd that this exists. Thank God Terry Goddard has pursued this issue for so long, finally got on the ballot. I very much hope it passed. But we're in desperate need of reform. Campaign finance reform is something I think every voter wants.
Okay, and Lorena, favorite or least favorite?
I'm sure I'm going to have to advocate with the issue that's very important to me, a Proposition 308, which would allow in-state tuition for all residents in Arizona. This would even allow in-state tuition for some of my students that I interact with on the daily, who are some of the brightest minds in our state, and they just want an access to higher education at an equitable level. And so we graduate almost 3,000 undocumented students a year out of Arizona high schools that don't have access to in-state tuition. We need to be advocating for this community. It's a win-win for everyone. It has no tax increases to the state by any means at all. So you wouldn't be investing any money in this. And if, these 3,000 students, economically were to go on and, to the workforce, they could increase upwards of $24 million into our economy annually. So this is not just an economic issue, but I think the right thing to do for all residents in the state of Arizona.
Cool. We touched on 3 different ones. All right, we've hit an hour, but I want to hit on one more question before we go into closing statements, something about your ability to work across the aisle. So let's phrase this: Republicans have been in control of the Capitol for a long time. If they continue to hold the majority in next year, what issues, if any, do you think you can work with the majority party on? And I'm sorry, Lorena, why don't you start this one off?
Yeah, I think it is important. We need to be mindful that these issues that are coming to play in the legislature have, impacts on everybody in Arizona, obviously. But I think one that would probably most easily be able to work on is probably water, given that it's such a pressing issue. It is a now issue that if we do not really tackle this issue, none of us will be able to live comfortably in this state. And so I think that's probably something that I think we could get the best headway on, and having those discussions, but making sure that we're bringing the necessary stakeholders into these conversations, and listening to the experts, and ensuring that we have the right information moving forward regarding this issue.
Okay, I saw both of the other candidates here nod as she said water. So try to find another one. Seth?
This one.
So besides water, The good news is that in the last budget, the Republicans reached out to the Democrats. First of all, I'm very hopeful that Democrats will be in the majority, but should we find ourselves in a minority again, we now see Republicans reaching across the aisle. As I may have mentioned before, they have a problem with an extreme base who are not willing to engage with their own party. So when moderate Democrats are able to reach across the aisle to moderate Republicans, we can come to agreeable common sense solutions. Not just on water, but on things like reform, campaign finance reform. We can be coming to common sense solutions on a number of issues, because most of these issues, whether it's healthcare or education, they shouldn't be a partisan issue. And I think if you find like-mindedness among moderate, in the middle legislators, I think there's a lot we can agree on.
Wow, bipartisan campaign finance reform. You're reaching for the stars there. Okay, and Eva, want to
keep reaching, Seth? I like it. Yeah, so I think that there are issues where we might not agree on everything, but we can agree on something. And it's important to make headway where we can. I know that when it comes to education, that Democrats are not the only ones who want to find a permanent solution to the aggregate expenditure limit. So I think that that's a place where we have room to work. So I think that there's room in education. I think there's room in campaign finance, sure. And of course, there's room in water. We're all looking for solutions there. But again, I want to be an effective legislator. That's really important to me. And when the houses are divided this closely, I don't know that you can do that without being bipartisan and without looking for common goals and for common purpose. And so it's important to me to make relationships, to have conversations, to collaborate, and to do whatever it is I can to be as effective as I possibly can be for the people of Arizona. That's my job as a representative, and I'm committed to doing that.
Okay. All right, we've crossed the hour mark. Let's move on to closing statements. And since I don't want to give Eva the last word, since she got the first word, why don't you start us off with the closings?
Sure. Again, thank you to Clean Elections. These conversations are so important. It's disappointing that voters aren't able to, again, hear from our opponents. I think that that's meaningful and that's important. And this isn't the first opportunity that they've passed on. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the unpopularity of some of their positions. But what I can promise you is that this team is going to be accountable to the people of our district, that we're going to be honest and transparent, and that we're going to be present in our communities. It's really important to me to make myself available to the people who I promise to represent, and to do that in the best way that I possibly can. I'm committed to Arizona. I'm committed to finding solutions, and I hope that I can earn your support.
Thank you. Seth?
Yeah, to reach back to the last question, we all want what's the strongest economy possible here in Arizona, and I'm sure Democrats and Republicans can work together on this issue. So yeah, thank you to Clean Elections. I grew up in Arizona. I'm a business owner out here. I think one thing we can all agree on is that nobody is happy with the current political climate. Being told to hate people we've never met before because of a letter next to their name, being told to hate our neighbors. I think extremism on either side of the aisle is bad. I think it's destructive. I want to look at reforms to try to bring more serious, qualified candidates into office who are actually interested in representing their community. I think we've said it before, but we plan to represent everyone in this district, Republicans, independents, and Democrats. I'm confident our Republican opponents do not intend to do so, but we will be representatives for everyone.
Okay, and Lorena, the last word.
Yeah, thank you so much again for hosting us tonight. And this is such a wonderful opportunity for our district to really represent themselves for the first time. I believe in this community so strongly, and I do believe that us three we are the best candidates to help move our district and our state forward. At the doors, I talk to people all the time, and if there's a question that I can't answer, I love that I can say, "Oh my gosh, but I have a healthcare professional and I have an economics small business owner that can help us find those solutions." As an educator as well. So I think between the three of us, we have an incredible slate and incredible future representatives. And so I look forward to bringing these collaborative and community-minded solutions to the legislature. And I think, again, I will always echo community, because I think for so long we haven't had that type of representation in the legislature. And I think the legislature should look like their constituents. So I would be just humbled and honored to have your vote. And I'm committed to showing you that I will continue to be accountable, transparent. This is not just a short-term, but a long-term, commitment that I am giving to the citizens of Arizona. So thank you so much for having us.
All right, that concludes our debate. To the candidates, we thank you very much for participating tonight. We know it's not easy to put yourself out there. To the voters, thanks to all of you who took the time to watch the debate and inform yourselves ahead of the November 8th general election. As a reminder, all registered voters can participate in the general election, and we encourage you to visit azcleanelections.gov for official, accurate voting information. Thank you so much, candidates.